You have been calling it confusion because the truth would demand too much from you. You say you do not know what you want. You say you need more time, more clarity, a better sign, a cleaner moment. But beneath that uncertainty, something in you already knows. It has known for longer than you want to admit. The confusion is not the absence of an answer. It is the friction created when the answer you carry collides with the life you are still trying to preserve. Carl Jung spent decades studying this collision. He saw that a human being can live for years through a personality built for acceptance, survival, duty, and belonging. Then, often without warning, the deeper psyche begins withdrawing its cooperation. What once felt normal becomes exhausting. What once seemed admirable begins to feel false. The person you worked so hard to become starts feeling like the person you must leave behind. This does not always arrive as revelation. More often, it arrives as irritation. You become impatient with conversations you once tolerated. You feel tired after performing roles you used to carry automatically. Praise lands strangely, because it rewards a version of you that no longer feels alive. You hear yourself agreeing, while something in your body tightens. You walk away from ordinary encounters, with the disturbing sense that you abandoned yourself somewhere inside them. You may call this ingratitude. You may accuse yourself of becoming difficult, selfish, unstable, or overly sensitive. That accusation keeps the old structure intact. If the problem is your attitude, then nothing fundamental has to change. You can correct yourself, become more positive, make another compromise, and return to the arrangement that everyone understands. But the deeper self is not asking for a better performance. It is asking to be lived. Jung called the lifelong movement towards psychological wholeness individuation. It is not self-improvement in the ordinary sense. It is not the polishing of your social identity until it becomes more impressive. Individuation begins when the center of your life shifts away from the person you were trained to be and toward the totality of what you actually are. That shift changes what you can tolerate, what you can desire, and what you can continue pretending not to know. Your true self becomes impossible to ignore when the cost of betraying it finally exceeds the cost of changing your life. Before that point, adaptation can look like maturity. You learn which emotions create tension and hide them. You learn which ambitions make other people uncomfortable and shrink them. You learn which opinions earn approval and repeat them. You become fluent in the expectations around you. The reward is belonging. The price is that you slowly lose contact with the one who belongs. The social personality that performs this adaptation is what Jung called the persona. The persona is not a lie by definition. You need it to move through the world. It helps you fulfill roles, respect boundaries, and become understandable to other people. The danger begins when you mistake that useful mask for the whole of your identity. Then every impulse that contradicts the mask must be silenced, moralized, or pushed into shadow. At first, this division may make you successful. You become dependable because you never reveal your resistance. You become pleasant because anger has been forbidden. You become needed because your worth depends on usefulness. You become accomplished because stillness would expose how little of the striving is truly yours. The outer life can look coherent, while the inner life grows increasingly estranged. A woman sits in her parked car after work and does not turn the key. Her hand reaches for her phone, then falls back into her lap. She has answered every message, completed every task, and smiled at the right moments, yet she cannot make herself drive home. When she finally closes her eyes, the sentence she will not say appears with painful simplicity. I do not want this life. That sentence does not mean every part of her life is wrong. It means the arrangement can no longer contain the person emerging within it. The psyche often speaks in total language when subtle signals have been ignored. It creates fatigue, dread, resentment, fantasy, forgetfulness, and disproportionate emotion because polite requests did not work. What you experience as disruption may be an inner authority refusing further exile. If this remains unconscious, you will try to cure the messenger. You will optimize the schedule that is suffocating you. You will seek motivation for work that has lost its meaning. You will use discipline to force yourself back into relationships, identities, and ambitions from which your psychic energy has already withdrawn. You may succeed for a while, but every success will deepen the division because it proves that you can continue functioning without being inwardly present. The first movement of truth is often not certainty. It is the loss of your ability to lie comfortably. Jung understood that consciousness develops through tension between opposites. The familiar ego wants continuity. The deeper self, which Jung described as the organizing totality of the psyche, presses toward wholeness. The ego asks how to protect what has been built. The self asks what your life is trying to become. You feel the conflict as ambivalence because two centers of authority are speaking at once. A man sits at dinner while people discuss the promotion he is expected to accept. He nods, cuts his food into smaller pieces, and gives the practical answers everyone wants. Later, alone in the kitchen, he places both hands on the counter and stares at the unopened email. Nothing dramatic has happened, but his body has stopped participating in the future his mouth keeps describing. You are not failing to decide when your body resists the choice your persona has already approved. You are discovering that psychological truth does not always arrive as a thought. Sometimes it arrives as the end of your enthusiasm for what once secured your identity. This is why the old life can become unbearable before the new one becomes visible. The psyche removes energy from an exhausted form before it provides a complete replacement. Jung described psychic energy as moving according to its own compensatory logic. When conscious life becomes too narrow, one-sided, or false, the unconscious begins correcting it. Dreams intensify, fantasies return. Forgotten interests gain emotional force. Small moments provoke reactions that seem larger than the event because they carry years of unlived material. You want the new direction to arrive as a plan. Instead, it may arrive as a series of refusals. You no longer want to laugh at the joke. You no longer want to explain why something hurts. You no longer want to make yourself smaller so another person can remain comfortable. You no longer want the achievement that requires you to become absent from your own life. These refusals frighten you because they seem negative. Yet a boundary often appears first as the withdrawal of a false yes. A woman opens a group chat and watches the typing cursor blink. She writes the familiar reassurance, deletes it, then sets the phone face down. For several minutes, she feels guilty, almost physically, as if silence itself were an act of aggression. Then she notices that her breathing has become deeper. What you have been calling withdrawal may be the psyche reclaiming energy from agreements that required your disappearance. The relief you feel after not performing is information, even when guilt arrives beside it. But the true self is not simply whatever you feel in the moment. That would reduce individuation to impulse. Jung's psychology asks something more difficult. It asks you to distinguish between a reactive fragment and the deeper pattern seeking expression through your life. The shadow can demand retaliation. Fear can demand escape. Wounded pride can disguise itself as authenticity. The true self does not free you from responsibility. It makes your responsibility more exact. You know this difference by the quality of the inner demand. A reaction wants immediate discharge. It wants to punish, prove, expose, or flee. A deeper truth remains after the emotional heat has passed. It returns in quiet rooms. It survives your attempts to bargain with it. It does not always flatter you. Often it asks you to surrender an image of yourself that you have defended for years. A man receives a cutting message and drafts a reply that would end the relationship in one blow. He reads it 3 times, leaves the phone on the table, and walks around the block. The anger fades, but another knowledge remains. He cannot keep accepting contempt in exchange for connection. He deletes the attack and writes one clear sentence that changes the terms between them. Your true self is not the loudest voice inside you. It is the voice that remains when the need to perform, retaliate, and be approved has quieted. What persists without spectacle deserves your attention. The closer you move toward that truth, the more clearly you see the bargains that shaped your personality. Every persona is built around an exchange. You receive safety if you remain agreeable. You receive admiration if you remain exceptional. You receive closeness if you remain useful. You receive peace if you never name what others are doing. These bargains are rarely spoken. They are learned through facial expressions, withdrawn affection, praise, comparison, and the emotional weather of the rooms where you grew up. As a child, adaptation is intelligent. You cannot demand that an environment meet the full complexity of your nature. You depend on the people around you, so you become readable to them. You emphasize the qualities that receive warmth and hide the qualities that create distance. Over time, the adaptation stops feeling strategic. It feels like you. Jung's concept of the shadow names what happens to the disowned remainder. The shadow contains aggression, envy, need, grief, sexuality, creativity, ambition, tenderness, dependence, spiritual longing, and any other quality your conscious identity cannot admit. It is not merely the dark or immoral part of you. It is the unlived part. Some of your greatest capacities may have gone into shadow because they threaten the role that kept you loved. This is why becoming yourself can initially feel like becoming worse. The agreeable person discovers anger. The endlessly capable person discovers need. The rational person discovers longing. The selfless person discovers ambition. The independent person discovers a desire to be held. Each discovery contradicts the moral story on which the persona depends. A woman is asked to take on one more family responsibility. She opens her mouth to say yes, as she has done for years. But the word does not come. Her sister's expression changes, and shame rises immediately in her chest. She grips the edge of the chair and says, quietly, that she cannot do it this time. What feels like selfishness may be your first honest encounter with a need that was exiled because everyone benefited from your lack of limits. The guilt does not prove the boundary is wrong. It proves the old bargain has been interrupted. Once that bargain becomes visible, projection begins to loosen. Jung showed that what remains unconscious within you is often experienced as though it belongs entirely to someone else. You condemn another person's arrogance while refusing your own authority. You obsess over someone else's freedom while keeping your own desires imprisoned. You resent people who take up space because your identity depends on asking permission. You idealize those who live boldly because they carry a life you have not permitted yourself to claim. Projection makes the inner conflict appear external. It lets you remain innocent of your own unlived potential. As long as courage belongs to someone else, you do not have to risk being seen. As long as selfishness belongs to someone else, you do not have to examine the secret resentment produced by your generosity. As long as authenticity belongs to the rare or gifted, you can continue treating your own truth as impractical. The moment projection returns to you, admiration becomes responsibility, envy becomes instruction, disgust becomes a question. The emotional charge around another person begins showing you where your own psyche has been split. A man watches an old friend announce a career change. He closes the post, opens it again, and feels an immediate urge to mock the decision as naive. For the rest of the evening, he lists every reason the friend will fail. Before sleep, he remembers the application he has kept unfinished for 6 months. The person who disturbs you may be carrying a permission you have denied yourself. Your intensity is not always evidence about who they are. Sometimes, it reveals the life in you that has become tired of watching from a distance. As the projections weaken, your relationships change because you stop asking other people to hold pieces of you. This does not guarantee harmony. It often produces the opposite at first. Systems resist the person who changes their role. A family organized around your compliance experiences your boundaries as betrayal. A friendship built around your self-deprecation may struggle with your confidence. A workplace that rewards your overfunctioning will call your limits a decline in commitment. You may hope that becoming more authentic will make everyone understand you. That hope is another bargain. It says you are willing to tell the truth only if the truth is received kindly. But individuation does not come with social insurance. The more honestly you live, the more precisely you discover which relationships can meet a real person and which depended on a role. Jung knew that individuation separates before it reconnects. Psychological development requires differentiation, the ability to recognize where your values, feelings, and responsibilities end and another person's begin. Without differentiation, closeness becomes fusion. You do not love freely. You manage reactions. You anticipate needs. You abandon your position before conflict can expose the difference between you. A woman tells her mother that she will not visit that weekend. There is a pause on the line, followed by a sigh she has feared since childhood. She almost reverses the decision, then presses her feet into the floor and lets the silence remain. After the call, she cries, not because she chose wrongly, but because she finally felt the old mechanism in real time. What you experience as loneliness may be the space that appears when you stop purchasing connection with self-abandonment. That space hurts because the false closeness was still a form of closeness. Its loss deserves grief. Grief is one of the clearest signs that the true self is becoming conscious. You do not only grieve people or circumstances, you grieve identities. You grieve the years spent proving something that never nourished you. You grieve the version of the future that once organized your sacrifices. You grieve how long you waited for permission from people who could not give it, because your awakening threatened the arrangement they understood. The ego often interprets this grief as evidence that change is a mistake. It assumes that the right path should feel clean, energizing, and certain. But Jung's understanding of transformation was never so shallow. Every genuine development involves death at the symbolic level. An old orientation loses authority. Familiar meanings collapse. The personality enters a period in which the previous center no longer holds, and the new center is not yet stable. This is the territory of the nigredo, the dark and disorienting phase Jung drew from alchemical symbolism. It is not glamorous. It can feel like failure, emptiness, or loss of identity. What is dissolving may have been restrictive, but it was also familiar. It gave you coordinates. Without it, you may feel less like yourself, precisely because the self you recognized was organized around adaptation. A man clears a shelf after leaving a profession that defined him for 20 years. He picks up an award, wipes dust from the glass, and places it in a box. For a moment, he considers putting it back, not because he wants the old work, but because he does not know how to introduce himself without it. He closes the box and sits on the floor beside it. The sadness that follows an honest ending does not invalidate the ending. You are grieving a structure that protected you, even while it confined you. Both realities can be true. When your true self becomes impossible to ignore, time itself begins to feel different. Delay is no longer neutral. Each postponed conversation carries weight. Each false agreement echoes longer. Each morning spent inside an unwanted life feels less like patience and more like participation. You become aware that indecision is also a decision, one that repeatedly gives the present arrangement another day of your life. This awareness can create urgency, but urgency has to be held carefully. The ego may try to convert awakening into dramatic action, because dramatic action restores a feeling of control. You may want to quit everything, expose everyone, move without preparation, or destroy what you have built simply to prove you are free. But the self does not require chaos as evidence of sincerity. A true change can be quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Jung described the ego's task as forming a conscious relationship with the unconscious, not surrendering blindly to it. Your inner truth needs a vessel. It needs language, timing, responsibility, and form. If you act without reflection, the shadow can hijack your liberation. If you reflect without acting, the persona can turn insight into another performance. The work is to let consciousness and depth enter a living dialogue. A woman opens a resignation letter on her laptop every night for a week. She does not send it in a burst of rage. She reviews her savings, speaks honestly with one trusted person, and removes expenses she no longer needs. On the 8th morning, she sends the letter with steady hands, and then sits quietly, feeling fear without interpreting it as a command to retreat. Your fear does not necessarily mean no. Sometimes fear is the nervous system registering that the old identity can no longer predict what happens next. You do not need to romanticize the risk to recognize the truth beneath it. There is another change that occurs when the deeper self gains authority. Your desire for explanation weakens. For years, you may have believed that if you could explain yourself perfectly, no one would be hurt, disappointed, or angry. You treated clarity as a form of control. You supplied context, softened every sentence, and presented evidence for needs that should not have required a trial. But explanation can become a disguised request for permission. You keep talking because the other person has not yet approved your reality. You search for the sentence that will make your boundary painless to them. You interpret their refusal to understand as proof that you have not communicated well enough. In this way, Your truth remains suspended until someone else validates it. Jung's individuation requires an internal locus of authority. This does not make you infallible. It makes you responsible for examining your motives and then standing inside what you know. You remain open to correction, but you stop treating resistance as automatic evidence that you are wrong. You learn that another person's disappointment can be real without becoming your moral verdict. A man tells his partner that he needs an evening alone each week. When questioned, he begins offering a long defense, then hears the familiar pleading in his own voice. He stops, breathes, and says that solitude helps him remain present in the relationship. The answer is not warmly received, but he does not withdraw it. What you have been calling poor communication may sometimes be your refusal to accept that clear communication cannot guarantee agreement. Your truth becomes real in your life when it no longer depends on unanimous consent. This is where authenticity loses its romantic surface. The true self does not only ask you to express hidden preferences. It asks you to bear the consequences of no longer organizing your life around avoidance. You may lose approval. You may disappoint people who sincerely love you. You may discover that a dream was inherited rather than chosen. You may have to admit that your kindness contained fear, that your loyalty contained dependency, or that your patience was partly an inability to confront. The deeper self threatens not only what traps you, but also what makes you feel innocent. That is the shadow beneath the shadow. You may prefer to imagine that you were simply suppressed by circumstances, misunderstood by others, or delayed by obligations. Some of that may be true, but there is a more uncomfortable truth. The false life also protected you. It protected you from visibility, uncertainty, envy, criticism, and the possibility of discovering the limits of your gifts. It allowed you to blame the cage without testing whether you could walk in open ground. Jung insisted that becoming conscious involves moral effort because insight creates responsibility. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer participate in it innocently. You know when you say yes to avoid conflict. You know when you diminish yourself to prevent another person's discomfort. You know when you call fear practicality. You know when you use endless preparation to postpone exposure. The old behavior may continue, but it no longer feels unconscious. That is why it becomes more painful. You may still be waiting for the moment when courage removes the fear. It may never come. Courage often appears only after you have acted while fear remains. The true self does not guarantee emotional comfort. It gives suffering a different meaning. There is the pain of betraying what you know, and there is the pain of honoring it. One pain makes you smaller. The other asks you to grow large enough to contain your own life. A woman stands outside a room where her family is waiting. In her bag is a letter confirming a decision they will not understand. She touches the handle, lets go, and looks down the hallway as if an easier life might still appear there. Then she enters, not because she feels certain, but because returning to secrecy has become more unbearable than being seen. What you are afraid to lose may be exactly what required you to remain divided. This does not make the loss easy. It makes the cost honest. You must also confront the possibility that no one is coming to authorize your becoming. The mentor may not appear. The family may not finally recognize your nature. The perfect opportunity may not arrive before you begin. The apology may never be spoken. The people who benefited from your old identity may continue describing your growth as a problem. If your transformation depends on their recognition, they remain the hidden center of it. You are still living in reaction to them, even if the reaction now looks rebellious. Individuation is not doing the opposite of what others demand. That is still captivity. It is discovering a position that belongs to you, then accepting that some people will interpret it through needs you cannot control. The cost may include your fantasy of being understood by everyone you love. It may include the fantasy that truth automatically repairs relationships. Sometimes truth reveals that repair is possible. Sometimes it reveals that the relationship was sustained by silence. You do not get to choose the revelation in advance. You may lose your role as the easy one, the strong one, the rational one, the spiritual one, the person who never needs anything. Without that role, you will meet emotions you once outsourced to the shadow. Need may feel humiliating. Anger may feel dangerous. Desire may feel irresponsible. Rest may feel like failure. To become whole, you must learn to experience these states without letting them rule you and without banishing them again. This is not a return to some pure, untouched essence. There is no hidden version of you waiting beneath history, perfectly formed and free of contradiction. The true self is not a fixed character you uncover. It is a living relationship with the whole psyche. It includes what you chose, what happened to you, what you inherited, what you rejected, and what still seeks development. It asks for participation, not discovery alone. That participation changes ordinary moments. You pause before the automatic yes. You notice when laughter leaves your mouth but not your body. You hear resentment before it hardens into contempt. You recognize admiration as a clue. You let grief speak without turning it into a command to return. None of this looks dramatic from the outside, yet the center of your life is moving. The choice before you is not whether to feel afraid. It is whether fear will remain the author of your identity. The choice is not whether anyone will be disappointed. It is whether their disappointment will keep deciding what you are allowed to become. The choice is not between pain and peace. It is between the familiar pain of self-division and the uncertain pain of wholeness. You are allowed to stop arguing with what has become clear. You are allowed to stop gathering evidence against your own experience. You do not need one more exhausted morning to prove that something is draining you. You do not need one more humiliating conversation to prove that a pattern is real. You do not need to turn another person's inability to meet you into a philosophical puzzle. You can acknowledge what is happening without exaggerating it and without minimizing it. You are allowed to stop performing gratitude for circumstances that require your absence. Gratitude does not mean permanent consent. Love does not require indefinite self-erasure. Responsibility does not demand that you remain loyal to every identity that once helped you survive. You can honor what a chapter gave you and still know that it has ended. You are allowed to disappoint the image others carry of you. That image may have been built from genuine memories, but it is not a contract. You have changed. Some changes are corrections. Some are expansions. Some reveal capacities that had no safe place to emerge before. You do not owe permanent sameness to people who became comfortable with one season of your life. You are allowed to move slowly without pretending you are still undecided. Inner recognition and outer change do not always occur at the same speed. Practical realities matter. Commitments matter. Other people can be affected by your choices. Deliberation can be an expression of integrity when it serves truth rather than avoidance. You can prepare carefully while refusing to return inwardly to sleep. You are allowed to seek support. Individuation is not isolation, and psychological depth is not a substitute for therapy, wise counsel, or honest relationship. The aim is not to become unreachable. It is to enter connection without requiring another person to carry your authority for you. Help can strengthen your capacity to choose. It does not have to choose in your place. Most of all, you are allowed to stop treating your emerging self as an inconvenience that must justify its existence. The deeper life in you has already spent years speaking through fatigue, resentment, dreams, longing, and the quiet relief that follows honesty. It is not asking to be worshipped. It is asking to be included. At the beginning, you called this confusion because confusion postponed the cost. Now you can see that the uncertainty had a structure. One part of you knew, and another part feared what knowing would require. The conflict was real, but it was not emptiness. It was the sound of an old identity losing its authority. You do not need to hate that identity. It carried you. It found belonging, avoided dangers, earned approval, and created continuity when you needed those things. You can thank it without giving it the rest of your life. Integration means that the persona returns to its proper place. It becomes a tool of relationship, not a prison mistaken for a self. The true self does not arrive with noise. It becomes visible through what you can no longer betray, without feeling the betrayal. It becomes audible in the sentence that keeps returning after every argument against it. It becomes real when you stop asking whether you are permitted to know what you know. Everything changes then, even before anything outside you has changed. The center from which you choose is no longer the same. Your life may still contain uncertainty, grief, compromise, and fear, but these no longer automatically mean you are lost. They may mean you have finally stopped abandoning the one who is trying to find a way through. Your true self becomes impossible to ignore, not because it suddenly begins speaking, but because you finally become unwilling to keep translating its truth into silence. What changes is not that the path becomes easy. What changes is that the cost of leaving yourself behind is no longer one you agree to pay. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you can explore Jung's psychology and the path of individuation. Watch the video on your screen now to understand what happens when your old identity begins to fall away.